You are in this session for Crash and Pay, owning and cloning payment devices with Peter Fillmore, so please give him a warm round of applause. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Today I'll be working on contactless card devices, and more specifically devices where you're doing payments through them. So for my agenda for this talk, we'll be going through the basics of a payment transaction over contactless, what attacks are out there, how they basically interact quickly, how you can clone a MasterCard or a Visa card, the issues in EMV payment, a little bit on Apple Pay, and trying to cover the tools I've used and software developed in how I've learnt these subjects. So a key thing in this area is the definitions. In payments, you get a lot of acronyms defined in how a transaction occurs. The key ones are the ATC, the Application Transaction Counter. So this is a monotonic counter which is used to denote the number of transactions a card has produced. So this is a fairly important number in the payment system to track fraud, to track the current use of the card, and it's used in the calculation of cryptograms and CVV codes. The second definition is the unpredictable number. So this is a random number or a counter or a combination of a date and counter used in transactions to try and prevent cloning of transactions and cards and generally introduce security to a device. And the final one really to note for this talk is the CVV or dynamic CVV codes. We're all fairly familiar with CVV codes. They're what you enter in on when you're doing an online purchase. They're printed on the back of your card. These codes are used to ensure that the tracked data hasn't been changed and are used to prevent and detect any fraud. Okay, so now I'll cover a basic payment transaction flow from a card. So for this talk, I'm going to go more at a higher level than normal for contactless cards. The lower level stuff is similar across all ranges of cards. You'll find that there's Type A and Type B standard ISO cards. At this level with the payment transaction, it doesn't matter what type of card at this point it is, we're going higher level bytes in a transaction. So the initial transaction is all generated from the terminal. So the terminal is the item that basically drives the payment flow. It tells the card what it needs and what to do and what to return. The card responds back with fields determining on what the actual command from the terminal was. So this can be, for example, a list of tags for information for a transaction, or CVV codes or static records delivered from the card. So in this case, you see the initial transaction flow. This is the same for pretty much all EMV payment cards. So here you've got the select payment systems environment command. This is standard across all MasterCard, Visa, American Express cards in the NFC specification. This is where the terminal is indicating it wants to use a payment card and it wants to use the payment system on the card. The card will respond back with its payment directory. This is indicating what the card supports. So it can support, normally you'll find a card will only support one type of account, so normally a debit or a credit account, for example, but it is out there in terms of cards can be a debit and a credit card integrated into one. In this case, this card was only a credit card, so it's basically responding back with the MasterCard, I think, AID. The terminal then selects that application ID. and then we send back a few tags required by the terminal to undergo and verify transaction details. So this is the FCI, the file control information. So that's the selected application ID and the PDOL, which is a processing data options list. So this provides a list of data that the terminal needs to send to the card to perform a transaction. Things like what the card supports, what the transaction parameters are. Following on, the Get Processing Options list uses the PDOL list and the terminal will glue all these fields together. In the case of a MasterCard transaction, you'll normally find that's a zero length field, so that's 8300. In the case of a Visa card, it's a number of other fields in there. So generally you're looking at what the terminal supports in terms of the transaction, currency codes, unpredictable numbers, that kind of thing. The card responds with the application AIP and the application file locator. The AIP is a set of bits that indicate what the card supports. So what modes the card support in terms of the verification, does it support backwards compatibility modes, that kind of thing. And then after this, we generally go and start reading static records from the card. So in this case, we're doing the read record 1.1, which is short file indicator 1, track record 1. And you can see here that we've got a lot of data coming back from the card. So for this selected in the EMV standard, normally you'll find this is where you get your track 1 data. So your magnetic stripe equivalent data, that kind of thing, from the cards. All these commands are pretty much the same across all brands of card. So for a MasterCard magstripe transaction, we perform a cryptographic checksum after this. So this is specific for the MasterCard operation. A MasterCard magstripe transaction is a legacy mode that we'll discuss further on, where we're trying to integrate an older system into a new EMV system into older payment networks. So here we're looking at generating a cryptographic checksum based off the unpredictable number, which is in the red on the terminal. So the terminal sends out the unpredictable number, which is 4 bytes. The card then sends back the CVC3, which is your dynamic CVC code, and the application transaction counter. So at this point, in a MasterCard magstripe transaction, you've finished the payment flow. What the terminal then does is bundle all this together, place it into track data, and send it off to your payment processor for authorization. Now, the second type of support mode in MasterCard is an M-chip support. M-chip is a cut-down version of your card, your EMV or chip card design. So here we have to read a lot more information to verify the transaction. So here we're reading a lot more records, a few more records, and more records. These generally, you can see here that you're sending public key and certificates and signed data at this point. So here the terminal is requesting the ICC public key. The ICC public key is used to encrypt and create a challenge, which is then sent in the transaction as well and verified. This ensures that nothing has changed on the card and is fairly standard EMV process overall. So the final thing with an M-chip transaction is that you generate an application cryptogram. The application cryptogram is a signature performed by the ICC private key and sent to the terminal for each transaction. The idea behind this is to ensure that you've got a dynamic signature on the data sent from the card and ensure that the transaction amounts, currencies, the application transaction counter are all signed in a transaction. So the issue with this is that you need to have 2 modes in a MasterCard. In this case, you have a legacy mode and the newer mode. The newer mode generally is the more safe mode, but requires a lot more information to be sent over a wire. So for now, I'll go over the different kind of attacks that are out there in terms of what is realistic and what is more theoretical. The key attack is really the one that is the most used is actually just stealing someone's card out of the mail. The thing with contactless cards is that you don't generally have the authorization, but the authentication on whether it's your card or not. So you don't have to enter a PIN number, for example, to use it. You just have to swipe it or tap and go to use the money. And generally, this is the major form we've been hearing about in terms of police being worried about these cards. However, you are limited by the transaction amounts with these kind of cards as well. So it's £20 in the United Kingdom, $80 in Australia, and in the US, I think it's $20 before you have to insert the card. So you generally have a limit of the amount of losses you can take out of a card. The second form of attack is a relay attack. In an EMV system, you don't have any bounding properties. So someone can read your card and have the transaction go across continents to another terminal. These were talked about in 2007 and 2012, and there's a newer talk in 2015 on how to do relay attacks. They are fairly simple, where you're just taking a card, emulating a terminal, sending it through the internet to another device, and then the other person needs to be at the payment device to make that payment at the time. So you can't store and forward transactions. You need to actually do them in real time to actually perform this kind of fraud. So it's kind of difficult in terms of being worried about it. Those are really the two major types of fraud you see in systems at the moment. Solutions to these kind of things are you want to authenticate the user, so an Apple Pay with a thumbprint, or an example is in Australia, if you do multiple contactless transactions, it'll prompt you to enter your PIN during that transaction. Another way is to make the user insert the card and use the chip interface as well. You can also block the card just by using tinfoil or alfoil around the card. That blocks enough of the signal really that no one really can read it out of your pocket. That's a key thing with these cards, is that you can't turn them off when you've got them in your wallet. You need to shield them simply, or cut a hole in them. So on card cloning, this talk was really inspired by a lot of the information coming out where people were saying you can clone these cards. I wanted to basically talk about that in terms of what can you really clone? Can you clone them or not? My thought was no. I thought that there was enough protections in place and the cards are generally well made that you couldn't. The reason I thought this is that the chip card interface and the NFC interfaces can be thought of a mini high security module. They're really well tested. They've got a small attack surface, and they're pretty heavily lab tested in terms of the card manufacturing. So you've got semi-formal design, side channel attack analysis, and very small amount of API you can access in terms of fuzzing and that kind of area. You've also got cryptographic keys embedded in these cards. And these keys generally are derived for that card to ensure that even if you broke open the card and obtain the key, you only get the keys for that card, not across the whole range of devices. Additionally, you've got dynamic signatures on transactions as well. So here is the list of different fields used in the M-chip mode or the EMV combined data authentication modes. And you can kind of see there's a lot of information provided and signed in these in the information that's sent off for the payment system. So you've got amounts, unpredictable numbers, transaction areas, and dynamic numbers as well in a signature. Now, you do have issues in terms of, for the cryptographers out there, with the types of algorithms used. Because these systems were proposed and written up 15, 20 years ago, you're looking at cryptography and hashes that are generally not seen as being ideal for use. So in a card, you'll be using SHA-1 hash, and normally the private keys will be an RSA 1024-bit key. And that's fairly fixed in the industry, and it's probably not the greatest thing, but that can be covered for another day. So I thought, well, you probably can't do it. The way the standard's written, when you go through the process, it seems fairly well put together in terms of the cryptography and the operations used. But then I found a paper by Michael Rowland and a talk which discussed transaction cloning, and more specifically around how you can store and replay transactions from cards, and especially contactless cards. The reason behind this is because you need to have these legacy modes to support older networks and payment processes. And as such, the MasterCard, Visa, the large companies have implemented these legacy modes to ensure that we can use our cards wherever without too much hassle. And the issue with these legacy modes is that they're very significantly cut down compared to a full chip EMV solution. So these legacy modes, in MasterCard, it's called a magstripe mode. For Visa, it's a dynamic CVV, or more modernly, a CVN17 mode. So we'll go into cloning transactions. So how would we clone a transaction? On magstripe mode, you want to generate track data that's similar to a system. So in this mode, we're basically making a dynamic CVV and inserting that into regular track data and sending that off. So traditionally, you'll have a track field as pictured below, where you've got name, discretionary data, the service code. In the case of a NFC card, you'll find that the name's normally blanked out, and your discretionary data is used to store the values to calculate the dynamic signature with the code. So you've got your application transaction counter, you've got the unpredictable number, and you have a issuer initialization value. You encrypt these, you then truncate it, and you fit it into the discretionary data of the track. The issue with this track data is that it's a limited field. You're generally, because you're using old systems and old equipment, they will have a fixed length, normally 80 bytes or so, or lower than that, depending on how they process transactions. So you can't throw a whole heap of information into the track data. You kind of need to truncate it and process it so it gets performed correctly. So the issue with the MasterCard magstripe mode came about because of these limitations. So the unpredictable number, when I originally thought was secure, I thought that was a binary field where we were fine because we've got 4 bytes and you're looking at 4.2 billion or so errors. So this 4 bytes basically then has to be binary coded decimal. So then 10 to the 8, 100 million, that's fine. However, the issue is you need to also limit the size of the data in the magnetic stripe. What this means is you're limited by the number of fields you can use. So in this case, you've got a UN length of 2. In that case, that's 10 to the 2 values, which means there are only 0 to 99 numbers for the unpredictable number. And this is set by the issuer on the card. So the issuer sets these fields on the card when they actually generate the area. So in this case, it's the K track is non-zero bits, so the total size of the bit minus the T track, which is the number of bits that have been set, and that gives you how much room you have for the UN field in the discretionary data. So this is where the issue comes around. Because of the fact you're taking what is seen as being a random number and you're reducing the length of it to fit in these older systems, it actually introduces the ability to clone transactions. And now my clicker's not working. Great. Okay, so how to clone a transaction. Firstly, you read and copy the records. You can then generate a dictionary based off the compute cryptographic checksum. So this is where you basically send a whole heap of these commands to the card when it's in the reader field, such that you can then generate a dictionary to look up the appropriate field in the future. This will increment the application transaction counter, but as I've tested in the actual field, it doesn't actually matter in certain payment processes. You then flip the M-chip support bit, so this is tag 82 on the card. That indicates that the card only supports a legacy mode in this case. So on the Android application I made to do this, I just flipped that bit and now it will be defaulting to that area. After this, I can then go to the terminal and replay the stored records. So I initiate the transaction, hold my phone up. The application then looks up the unpredictable number in the dictionary and replays it back for the transaction. And then you collect the purchase, basically. So how long does this normally take to actually clone a card in terms of this field? In this case, I made an application here to actually give you the amount of time it normally takes to do this, to calculate these amount of transactions. So if you want to do 100 compute cryptographic checksums, it takes around about 25 seconds or so. Actually less than that, 20 seconds. In the case of 10,000 transactions, you're looking at 25 minutes. So this is each time you add an extra decimal place, you're adding a large factor of time on to actually clone the card. So hopefully so I pre-recorded the demo for this because I didn't want to bring the whole terminal with me. But hopefully this can show you now how quick it is. Okay, so this is my payment card at home and the application on here. So this is just a stock Android phone here. And then I programmed it to do this dictionary. So at the moment it's generating the dictionary and storing it on the database. And once it's done, and this is the reader that I bought off eBay. So this is a reader that will only do magstripe mode. So this will send the random number. So I select the card, and hopefully it should be okay. And when you beep the card, it should say, oh good. Yeah, so that's a transaction, simply put. That's how quickly you can actually perform this kind of cloning. And the good thing about this kind of attack is that you get multiple times to use those records as well. Because as long as if the terminal sends out a low random number, then you're sending the lower application transaction counter. So I've found on average I get maybe 3 goes at it before it's above the application transaction counter of the current card, and so I can't generate it. Additionally, you can stop the transaction, for example, and force it and just keep doing transactions over and over till you hit the random number you want for the correct generated CVC code. And the issue with this is that it's actually built into the MasterCard system. So this is off the M-chip requirements, which was published in 2013. And they require that the unpredictable number is must be at least 2 digits. Generally, the issue with these kind of requirements is that you can say 2 digits, but most of the time the issuer will probably set it at 2 digits because they read 2 digits. I've seen 2, 3 and 4 normally. 4 is on a better card. You want a 4-digit card, for example. So the fixes for these kind of attacks is that the ATC, the application transaction counter, will jump in the field. This means that you can detect it on the processing side. The issuer should prompt for a second factor of authentication if that jumps. So if it goes off and tries to do the payment, it should go back to the terminal and basically ask for the customer to authorise it using some other method. And generally, the payment processors should basically reject anything that isn't an M-chip transaction. At this stage, it shouldn't be that we have to support these legacy modes, simply put. So, cloning a Visa, basically. The issue with Visa are that there are a number of different modes that they have implemented over time. The original legacy mode was the dynamic CVV mode, and this was updated for a cryptogram CVN 17 mode after it was recognised that that was a terribly broken form of generating a code. And these are set by the TTQ, which is the Terminal Transaction Qualifier, and this basically sets these different modes according to what the terminal supports. So here we have a terminal telling you what it supports in that area. So in the case of a DCVV mode, it's a really simple transaction. All we do is the initialization, the selection, and we then do the read record. And that will return track data with a CVV code embedded in it that should be dynamic. The issue with the DCVV algorithm, which was patented, is that you can see here there isn't any random number being input into the algorithm. So here we've got an application transaction counter, the primary account number, but there's no random number or any randomness to it. What this allows you to do is clone very easily. All you have to do is copy the records, set your magstripe bit on the terminal to magstripe mode, and then you just have to replay the records. You don't have to generate 100 different transactions or have it jump application transaction counters in it. So for the demo, it's a lot quicker than the other demo. So here is a demo using a common Visa card. So I bought this prepaid card to test with, and so naturally it doesn't read very well. But once it actually does connect it to the reader, it just works basically. It's a lot quicker. And the thing with this card is that it's a static CVV as well. So they're not even dynamically doing the CVV. They are basically setting it to a static value. And in Visa's documentation, that was fine. Fortunately, they're phasing out these modes on Visa's side. So this was written, I think it was 2008, where they're phasing out the cryptogram version for newer numbers. The key thing is the issuer of the card can disable these modes. So they are disabled generally in a Visa debit card. So the Visa debit cards I have won't actually support magstripe or legacy modes. Additionally, they made a newer mode called CVN 17. So this is where we are actually generating a cryptogram separate, which isn't embedded in the track data. So we have to send this separate from the command. So in these issues, generally, you have a huge amount of problem with the terminals. The issue with these terminals generally are for contactless terminals, for the standalone EMV chip terminals, is that there's a lack of physical security protections in them. There's a lack of software security protections in them. The device I got off eBay, but in this case, it had exposed JTAG ports. The manufacturer was nice enough to send me the firmware, which was unencrypted and not signed. And so I could change anything on that firmware and upload it to the device and have it do what I want, simply put. And this is common across most of the contactless readers you'll see. They are off-the-shelf processors with inbuilt debugging facilities that are easy to access. There's nothing really to stop you from changing the code on them without any undue effort. Additionally, unpredictable numbers are a real issue as well. These are integral for EMV security. However, they're not defined to be from a cryptographic random number source. This was only brought up, I think it was 2 years ago, where a note was added due to these issues from EMVCo, who do the standard for EMV transactions, in that it was suggested maybe you should be taking this from a cryptographic random number source. But even to this day, they don't test the source of numbers, and there's no requirement when you're certifying a terminal that it is using a proper cryptographic random number source. Alright, so now I'll cover Apple Pay. Generally, Apple Pay, as we all know, around the last year or so, is the dominant form in the US for your contactless transactions. The hardware used is a fairly nice system compared to a lot of others I've seen. Key thing is this NXP 65V10 chip. This has a processor on there to perform the contactless transactions, and separately it also has a secure element chip in the package. So the secure element chip holds all your sensitive data. So this is where you're putting all your cryptographic keys and information that is read by the contactless processor and sent to the terminal for it. And these are all controlled through the software on the device. So in the case of Apple Pay, you're going through PassKit to the frameworks, to the daemons, to the hardware drivers, which interact over the, I think it's an I2C bus, to the chip on the device. Key thing is really that the device here is separate in terms of how it does a transaction. It operates on its own, as in the transaction all occurs in the chip once the iOS tells it to do a transaction, it'll do it by itself and send back the results. And as such, you find that it is susceptible to these kind of attacks as well. Because the device, the APIs that I've looked at, don't actually indicate any protections in them. It's all left up to the code that is not written by Apple, that is actually written by NXP on those chips. And that code, I think it was developed in 2010 off the top of my head, based off the sources on the Android area. So they're fairly similar. In Apple, you've got a PK payment token as well. Interesting thing about this is that it's a ECC encrypted token, and you've got EMV data in here. So this is what is returned from the secure element after a transaction. The encrypted payment data is where you've got your token, your expiry date, and your EMV data, and that can be sent over the internet and verified by the issuer, as well as a separate verification code area. So you find that once you decrypt that payment data, it's actually just got EMV tags that has responded back from the device. So I was playing around, I found this is a command where you can dump the approved AIDs. So these are the cards that are being loaded into your secure element. So in this case, this is the test cards that were loaded onto the device when I bought it from the shop. So it is vulnerable to these attacks. It does depend on the card that's loaded, so I'm pretty sure Visa debit cards aren't, but other credit cards will be, because you need to have these legacy modes. But the key thing is with the Apple Pay system is that it's really hard. You need to force someone to do the transaction. You need to enable the card to do the transaction and scan it to perform it. So just don't jailbreak your device if you want secure payments kind of thing. Additionally, if you're over a contactless limit, they offer this consumer device card holder verification method, which basically gives you a separate method over the internet which is in conjunction with your traditional CVV codes. So that means your magstripe mode can also use this CD, CVM to ensure that they know that transaction's going through. So generally, Apple Pay stuff, I find it's a lot more secure than your cards that have been sent out to you, due to the fact the card's not always on. So quickly, I will go through tools I used. So this is a common tool. I got it off eBay. It's a great little reader, and I've written a lot of software for it to emulate card transactions. I use the Proxmark to sniff transactions and work out lower level stuff, but generally, once you start to do the transaction area, it's a lot more fiddly, and the code for these EMV and NFC payment stuff isn't really there at the moment. The best option is an Android phone with integrated NFC. This was really good in terms of development of this stuff because it offers the card reader and an emulator. And additionally, you get a lot of the support for not having to integrate the initial transaction of the card. So what this gives you is the ability just to send packets, large bits of data, throw it at the chip in the Android system, and that will just emulate it out for you in that area. So the software I developed over this area is additions for RF Idiot, so Adam and Laurie's tool. These give you the ability to do transactions and test them for yourself. So this will do a transaction for a magnetic stripe, reader, M-chip, DCVV, and it'll spit out all the values, and you can start to check and see that the transaction counter increments or something static. Gives you all the information that you might not get from a commercial card reader out the box. Another one was a fuzzing program I've made for the Android as well. I don't think I've actually uploaded it yet, but it works pretty well. I've got it buzzing and going over and over again and crashing pretty well. This means that I'm kind of working on it still, but I'm really happy with it at the moment, how it's coming out. Okay, so finally, looking through these areas, it really takes into account the legacy modes need to be removed from a lot of these systems. I was able to clone my own card and use it in Australia, and that was a bit shocking to me considering how much smaller the number of banks and payment processors we have and how long we've had EMV workflows in our payment system. That's why I think in the US it's concerning for me in that I have a gut feeling that it's a lot more of a issue in the US due to existing technology and the love of mag stripes in the payment systems here. So best way of putting it is key things are that you can't clone cards economically, but you can clone transactions. Legacy support reduces your security in terms of transactions. Random numbers in these things aren't really random. They are, unfortunately. And the current standards do not mitigate the attack sufficiently. My major worries are really around the terminal stuff as well, and how they basically implement in that area. And unfortunately, I really want to kick Apple Pay, but I can't. It's one of the best methods I've seen in terms of implementing these kind of transactions, in that it's very widely supported and works excellently in terms of ease of use. And generally that's what you need for that area. Okay, so all good now. How am I looking for time? Okay, so I think that's all done. Okay, so thank you. And does anyone have any questions?